Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. Wonderful to see you all. It's fantastic to get the invite. I'm also highly cognizant of the fact that this is the last thing before dinner and we wrap up. So I'll get underway. And as mentioned at the intro, I come from a bit of an academic background. I tend to be more analytical and modeling focused. And so you're going to get a bit of hopefully it's not too much of an academic lecture. But I'd love to talk to you about kind of what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. And then what has actually happened based on what we thought was going to happen, which sets us up a little bit for kind of what's next, what does the next horizon of the energy transition look like. So I'll sort of structure this across those three parts. So we may run into some issues that I've got a lot of chart-heavy slides, and so I'll try to talk you through them as we go. But the first thing I'd like to say is, as someone who does this kind of work day in and day out, trying to see the future or write forecasts is really hard. And so as I go through this, it may seem like I'm throwing barbs at all the things that were said that turned out to be incorrect in the past. It's actually more of a setup for kind of the understanding of the ambiguity is real. And so the setup here is to say, the IEA, which is a very well-respected organization, has putting out global forecasts for energy consumption, the trends in how energy is going to evolve for many, many years now. And the one that they've taken quite a few shots on from external parties is their outlook on solar PV. And so if you look at the chart, the gray line shows you what has actually been installed over the last 10 or 15 years. And each of those colored lines that's shooting off from it is the forecast from that given year of what was expected by the IEA to happen over the next 10 or 20 years. And so you see what essentially happened was year after year, they went ahead and tracked what had happened and then kept drawing the line off to the right. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but it's sort of going to get to the underlying piece here about why there's so much uncertainty. And the thing about this chart is it tops out at about 100 gigawatts, is what was installed kind of in the end of the forecasting period here in 2017. And this last year, based on some research from BNEF, we saw something closer to 270. So you need to triple the height of this chart to get to where we are in 2022. The other thing to really talk about when we think about looking forward and forecasting, no one in the industry likes to call it a forecast. It's always an outlook or a scenario. We talk about things that are normative outlooks, which is to say, if we need to reach 1.5 degrees C, here's how many gigatons of carbon need to come out of the atmosphere in each year. Or if we need to get to a certain level of decarbonization in this country, this is the set of technologies that you'd install to do that. That's what a lot of these forecasts or scenarios are actually built on. What we're really sort of thinking about when we look back at an EIA or an IEA forecast is, we assumed it was predictive. Here's what we think is going to happen. And so we're sort of in this world where there's a lot of uncertainty, and you pick any one of your variables to go on, whether it be policy, something about black swan events, and suddenly you're going to get a completely different answer. And so it tends to be a tricky business, but that lets us actually kind of go back in time. And if we think about this, here's a chart showing on the left what was expected to happen globally. So each of those lines represent a technology that's supplying energy to the global economy. And the solid line gets you to what was then today in 2011, and the dotted lines go forward. And the thing to note is all the fossil fuels on the top, the coal, the oil, and the gas, are expected to grow pretty substantially out into the future, while we start to see the beginning of other renewables on the bottom. And in the US, the picture was actually sort of similar, except the expectation was a flat energy economy. Very little growth over the following 20 years. And by the way, you'd see about the same amount of coal energy in the system going forward as you did at the time period that was snapped there. And there's a little bit of growth in natural gas. And sort of these new variable renewables, solar and wind, barely make the chart. They're almost invisible. So we're sitting in this world of looking forward to its growth but boring. And at that time, McKinsey, and this is actually before my time at the organization, I've worked with a lot of the folks who developed this, we put together these marginal abatement cost curves. So the idea, and I think there were things referenced by George that are the update on that, and that I'm sure are much more deeply analytic than the old gigantic Excel files that would crash everyone's computer. But when we ran these, the idea here is to say, as you go from zero, what would a baseline case of no emissions reduction look like, all the way up to, in this case, our moderate view for this is for the United States, was by 2030, here's the cost to get up to 3 gigatons reduction from the baseline case. And by the way, we cut the price off at $50 a ton because that was an astronomically high number. Who would pay more than $50 a ton for carbon? If you see the scales of the charts on the previous presentation, I think there's an extra 0 on some of them. But the idea here was, can we actually just put everything together? There's nature-based solutions in there. There's energy economy solutions. It's kind of fun to look back and see that EVs didn't make the map. You know, why would you ever be able to afford a car that was purely powered by a battery? That's going to be too expensive. We've seen massive decline in battery costs in that time frame. Coal to gas was thought of as an expensive technology, which is quite the opposite of what we've seen happen over the last 15 years. And then, and this one's not meant to be a stab at the folks who were before me, but CCS was just coming online. We would be there soon, and this was 10 or 15 years ago. I'd like to think that we're now actually at the point where it is coming online, and we'll start to see more sequestration and the ability to permanently sequester carbon dioxide. But it was thought of as the thing that would already start to be taking off. And then finally, renewables sort of barely hit the chart. You're looking at energy efficiency and switching of fuels, but actually moving away from fossil fuels to clean power was out of the money in most cases. So we took this chart and we said, okay, if we look at our baseline emissions in the US in 2005, and this is not just energy sector, but across the economy, it was something like 7 gigatons. And if we march forward based on some government-related projections out to 2030, you get to, in kind of a business as usual case, close to 10 gigatons a year for the US across the whole economy. And this included some energy efficiency already. This wasn't assuming that everything just sort of snapped and got bigger. And then we looked at our curves and we said, you know, based on the policies that are out, the stated goals are something like removing 3.5 to a little over 5 gigatons of that by 2030, so that your run rate emissions are about half of what they would otherwise be. And when we looked at kind of that x-axis, you saw the previous slide was about 3. We had a version where we stretched it out and twisted some knobs and we got it to about 5. But the thought was, by 2030, if you work really hard, and the US has a $50 a ton, and that's in 2007 dollars, so you can sort of do the inflation math. But if we have a $50 a ton carbon price, maybe we can be somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 gigatons of emissions by 2030. So that's the history lesson. Hopefully, you know, I think a lot of folks probably have seen some of that come by in their careers. But what actually happened? The exciting thing to see, and again, we've got small charts with little numbers, but I can talk you through them, is that we actually landed in 2020 at 5.6 gigatons. And so we're not to 2030 yet. The future hasn't been written, but we're already in a place where we would only need to reduce 20% relative to today to hit the most extreme end of what was expected or what was thought kind of possible at the far end of policies, which, by the way, mostly were largely not put in place. And so these significant changes are actually coming from something that, when we'll go through it, wasn't impossible to predict, and yet somehow we missed it looking forward. And so where a lot of that came from is this is I tend to call them sand charts, but an area chart showing the total energy consumption in the US economy back from 2012 on the left all the way to the year that's just finished now in 2022. And you'll see on the bottom, there's a bit of growth in petrol and liquid oils or liquid fuels. But the real thing that's changed across that time period is coal reduced, the coal consumption reduced by almost half. And we continue to see reductions out now going forward, while gas consumption has grown pretty modestly. And the wind and solar, although I will admit it's starting from a low baseline, has grown 250% from that 2012 baseline, so 3.5 times then, and headed up from there. And so in a world where on a typical basis per energy unit used at the final consumption phase, coal is something like 2.5, 3 times more carbon intense than gas, and then obviously both are more carbon intense than power coming from wind and solar. We somehow missed the coal to gas switch that has happened, which has brought the power sector emissions down precipitously, and as a result across the economy, so we saw the notes from before. And so the part to call out here, as you look at that growth of the natural gas outlook, we already knew in 2011, so this is the 2013 Annual Energy Outlook from EIA, we knew in 2011, which is sort of the last year of the publication, that we would expect to see quite a bit more shale gas in the future. And so the expectation back then, about 10 years ago, was we were producing about 14 TCF annually in 2011, and then by 2020 we'd get all the way up to 18 TCF because we'd see this growth in the gas industry in the US. And what actually happened on the right was that 14 ended up being about 32. And so it wasn't that we picked up something like 25, 30%. We actually more than doubled and are headed up from there. And that switch and sort of the growth of the gas industry has been the engine behind reducing emissions in the US across the whole economy. And as we see coal power in Asia and friendly allies to the west here that we've discussed all day, you can imagine that there are pathways here where the LNG coming out of Alaska is actually starting to help enable those emissions reductions we saw there. Now, as we heard earlier, it's not an end state, but it is pretty dramatic to see that much of a change. And it'd be one thing if we were talking about 2007 when that cost curve came out, and you'd say, well, you could never have called the shale gas revolution in the Permian and Marcellus in the U.S. This happened after it was already taking off, and we still kind of missed somehow by a factor of 2. And so when you think about that, what that did to gas prices, this is a chart. The bar is kind of the line between history and forecast as of 2011. This is the cost per MMBTU, and again, $2011. There's a lot of inflation math that I've had to do in my head over the last couple of years as we've sort of changed the landscape of that. But in $2011, we saw prices around $4 an MMBTU, and the expectation was, we'd lose a little down there, and then we'd kind of hit the bottom of the shale gas period, and it would start to pick up again, and we'd end up somewhere around 8. The gray line tells you what actually happened to Henry Hub prices the last few years. The first thing is they were more volatile than you would have expected. The spike, I'm sure everyone here can call it, is our geopolitical sort of global events over the last year. But then the blue line now is the forward forecast today. And you can see it's significantly lower. In fact, it's a factor of almost 3 lower than what we would have thought in 2011. So that takes you to a world where you say, suddenly how I think about penciling out a project related to gas or coal or renewables, it's a completely different spreadsheet with a completely different project finance look when I look at those blue and gray lines versus the brown one. So you'd say, well, we kind of missed our entire thing. What's worth calling out, though, is if you actually look into the annual energy outlook, there are a bunch of lines. You can sort of pick and choose your own adventure for scenarios. And there was one line on the bottom that was the high oil and gas reserves. And if we play that forward, you actually see that the prices landed pretty close. Now, it's not perfect, but when you look at the relative difference, it's measured in percent, not multiples of what you would have seen. And that kind of sets you up for this world where you say, a forecast is hard to put together. We kind of knew we had this opportunity or we had this resource available to us. And if someone inside the EIA played forward what that would look like, you actually get a world that looks not that dissimilar from where we've landed today. They still missed the growth of wind and solar, but I think everybody on the planet did as of 12 years ago. I think almost everyone. I'm sure there's someone that tell me they had it right. And so that's the one half of it, and it's the solar and wind resources I think that we get pretty excited about going forward. There will be a number of resources we talk about that Alaska is particularly well endowed with in terms of natural availability. But the big thing to call out about variable renewables, and this is the wind and solar installations annually you see on this chart, is that the wind growth on green on the bottom has been relatively steady up and down. Solar is, by all sort of measures, taken off pretty dramatically over the last 10 years. But it's a huge cost reduction has been one piece of it, which has been funded by essentially policies and governments all over the world, in addition to the US. And then the second piece is that policy has driven some really weird market dynamics. Not to say that this is a boom bust, but we've had an expectation of subsidies at the federal level expiring and then saved at the last minute more than once. And that creates incentives to pull projects forward and get them commercially operating by the time that the incentive expires, which then leaves the pipeline of projects dry when it turns out that the incentive didn't expire. And that sort of back and forth policy uncertainty or sort of policy whiplash has driven some inefficiencies across the system. I think we expect the IRA that came through last year, once the dust settles on supply chain and labor and all of the pieces that are making things challenging now, to give a little more certainty going forward. But it's that sort of uncertainty that makes it difficult to build a business. And we see this from international investors. We see this from traditional energy companies who want to expand into the larger space of renewables, just trying to get their heads around how they manage a world where policy is such a big part of the answer. Energy is always related to policy, but in this case, it's such a big piece that it's awfully hard to kind of find the ways to invest. So that's all to say that these markets aren't simple as you put them together. And then comes the part that's even less simple. And I won't ask you to read the newspaper headlines and quotes from below. But the thing that we're seeing now is obviously we have disruption and we have volatility. We have a situation in Europe where the cutoff of gas meant that actually Germany went back and burned more coal than they'd planned to. So we're sort of backsliding a bit in terms of emissions. We know it's temporary, but the result of disruption is actually sort of pushed them back from commitments that they'd made and plans that they'd had. We also know that power and energy have been exceptionally expensive over the last year or two, to the point that some households are making decisions between eating and heating. And even though the US hasn't seen nearly the same shock as Europe, we have higher prices, and it's been felt across the economy, across all states. And then we see things like energy security, and I think that's been one of the big discussions here. It's partly about decarbonization, but it's often about energy security, because you bring an economy to its knees when you cut off energy, or when you drive the prices so high that it's impossible to keep doing business in the normal way. And then finally, there's a piece here about competitiveness. We've had a lot of discussions at my work in the world of green hydrogen. As many of you are probably aware, it's one of the big sort of subsidized pieces of the IRA. And what we've actually seen is a lot of European companies who were 100% devoted to the European market, because that was the place where green hydrogen was actually going to be economic and that's where it was going to take off, suddenly immediately open shop in the US and try to figure out how is it we're going to do this? How do we build a US hydrogen project? And you sort of took the attention of the top executives and the top leadership of the team immediately to the US because of that. The same thing's been true recently in sort of manufacturing and upstream. There is a real pull with some of the incentives to actually build that economy. And it creates both security across the supply chain, but also a lot of momentum to kind of drive forward and build the industries around the entire vertical value chain. But these sort of pieces around, hitting the transition, making sure that it's affordable, ensuring security, and sort of thinking through competitiveness of countries as a result of policy are starting to be really the building blocks that we sit behind when we think about the energy transition. And then the final thing to just sort of leave on the what's happened in the interim is when we look at electricity prices. Now, these are all in nominal terms, and so what you see as you go from left to right across the US and other states is that roughly we're looking at a 25 to 30% increase on average of power prices, which tracks pretty close to inflation. Alaska's been slightly higher, although the baseline starts quite a bit higher. Interesting things to call out places like California that's invested heavily in solar power and signing sort of clean power PPAs, but also in energy efficiency, which means that the average household is using less energy, so power bills don't tend to be that much higher. There's a lot that sits behind this number, but the fact is that even over the last 10 years, we've seen this tremendous sort of reduction in energy costs at the primary place from cheap natural gas. It hasn't actually translated into, say, home electricity price reductions. And it's something to think about going forward, because we expect the world to be a bit more volatile. Even as we clean up and we find ways to get price security, there is plenty of risk that this sort of continues to drive up and we actually put the burden on households and consumers to support the economy in a world that doesn't quite all square the circle we've wanted to lay out. So with that slightly negative note at the end of that piece, actually I'd like to talk about what we think happens next. So what is the next piece of this? There we go. So the first thing is what we've seen, it's since Paris, but in the ensuing years, and it's actually accelerated since we saw COVID sort of start in 2020, is we've got well over 100 countries that have made commitments toward net zero. And if you kind of add up the emissions as well as the GDP, we're talking about 90% of the planet has something that looks like a serious attempt to figure out net zero. And on top of that, we've got the private sector layered in. So more than 3,000 companies, and this data is old enough that we're probably at 3,500 or closer to 4,000 now. More than that number of companies have actually made commitments publicly to say, we know that it's important that we decarbonize, and we're going to figure out how to do it. I can tell you, and I'm sure people in this room know, not all of those commitments have incredibly detailed studies behind them with line-by-line action plans that will get them exactly to the answer. In some cases, it's a senior executive who knows the right thing to do is to sort of have the JFK moonshot moment and just declare it'll happen and we'll figure it out. So we are in that figuring out period. But the fact that those lines have been drawn in the sand is pretty exciting and encouraging to see. And this sort of links back to what I was saying just before kind of the break in slides, which is we really are going to need to hit something that looks like a quadrilemma. You need to make sure that you don't price your sort of economy out of competitiveness across the world, it needs to also be competitive or affordable for the residents who actually live inside the economy. And we actually have to push the transition. I'm sort of working up around the circle so that we get to something that looks like a clean energy economy. But it can't sacrifice the security in the bottom left. The last year has shown that you can almost land in one place where there's one big pipeline, Nord Stream in Europe, that the closure of that or the moderation of gas through that then ended up closing sent largely the entire economy across the globe into a bit of a spin. Now, there's a lot of events, geopolitics are very complicated. There's a lot happening coming out of COVID as well. But having those single points of failure certainly create a lot of risk. And so managing across all of this, it's both sobering, but it's also exciting because what it means is suddenly the business case doesn't need to just be, tell me what the lowest cost energy is and I'll hit that. There is something about diversity. There's something about thinking through your geopolitical trading partners. There's something about thinking about the trajectory that you're headed on, which makes places like Alaska exciting because of the exciting mix of resources that are available, location, potential for new projects and development. And so when we look forward, this is, at some point I was gonna have to show the dense McKinsey chart, and I think these are dense charts and this one's as far as dense as the others. But when we look at the power generation sector, it's kind of my wheelhouse that I sit inside of, we've seen there's something like 29% of power generated globally today comes from renewable resources, but it's taking off, and it's really wind and solar power that are picking up a large chunk of it. And what they're doing is they're meeting demand growth, and they're also pushing out particularly coal, but even some natural gas. And so we'd expect by 2050, even in a base case, if we continue in our current trajectory, taking into account commitments that have been made, that we'd see something north of 80% of electricity generated from clean sources. And part of that growth you see up to more than 80,000 terawatt hours isn't just that the emerging economies are growing, and that's a big piece of it. You'll see more electricity in Africa, better access, bringing more folks into the middle class in India and China and Malaysia. But it's also that we're electrifying things. We're taking uses that previously had been more fossil-based, maybe it's industry heating, we can move to heat pumps, and actually bringing more inside the power sector. And so this sort of creates a momentum to build the technologies and sort of build the global scaling and learning around these set of emerging technologies. But what that's also looking at now in the US is we have the IRA that's passed. And the two panes here on this chart that are really worth highlighting, on the left, it's a multi-$100 billion impact to the system. A big piece of it's in energy. There's a set of components of it that impact other parts of the economy. But this is the assessment, I think, that came out of the congressional office in August of last year. As we've talked to clients and as we've sort of had our ear to the ground, there's more work being done, and we'd say that the $400 billion estimate is probably on the very low end. And so this is a massive, massive multi-hundred billion dollar piece of legislation that on the right side is going to lead to something that gets us close to 40% reduction in emissions relative to 2005 levels, which, in a BAU case, we would have expected it to flatten out because, as I mentioned before, we replaced a lot of coal with natural gas. And at some point, coal stops being the main driver, and you've sort of squeezed that juice out as much as possible. This is the next kind of wave of how to get that set of emissions brought down, and a lot of it's really focused on the energy economy. So then we take our view on the right, which is McKinsey says electricity generation in the US is going to grow, and there's going to be a bunch of gas. We actually expect the gas industry to kind of continue to be the engine behind firm, stable power in the US, especially given the low cost of resources across the country, while we see tremendous growth in wind and solar. And then on the left side, again, I would love to fast forward 10 years and come back and put the slide up. We can decide who was right or wrong then. But you look at a different view that says, given the same set of information, maybe electricity doesn't grow, demand doesn't grow that much. We do see some growth in solar. By the way, the wind industry stops existing effectively as of the mid-2030s because there's no new wind built, and that the gas sector grows modestly. It's an interesting comment to say at this point with the same set of information looking at policies that we've got such divergent views, and I'm sure we could look at the different cases and we could take our cases and find ones that match up, but looking at a base case, the answer is far from certain at the moment. And a lot of that has to do with technology, and I am excited to look at these sort of emerging set of technologies And I don't think I've had as many discussions in one day about as many different technologies that actually have a real chance of being commercially viable. The thoughts around CCS and the sequestration potential in Alaska, when we think forward 10 or 15 years to actually building SMR nuclear reactors that could potentially power the state and actually power things like pink hydrogen production that could be exported through ammonia routes to Asia, all of this is very exciting. And what we see on here are a bunch of technologies that I think not many of them today are fully scaled, and the potential is quite massive. We've got geothermal, which the US has broadly speaking, one of the better potentials, but Alaska specifically does. And so if you imagine we've got this basket of technologies that are, I won't say it too loud, but like fusion, we're not quite there on the physics yet, but I think we might get there. I think very smart people are working very hard on that, but where these technologies exist and can be commercialized, it's a matter of finding the funding and the projects and doing the demonstrations and getting the right people figuring out how to bring the cost down and working out some of the engineering kinks. And then you can imagine what we end up with is we're here in Anchorage and we see at the inlet that there'll be wind turbines floating in the bay, and there's an LNG facility that's bringing gas down to export to Japan while the CCS facility ramps up, and you use that with geothermal power or potentially SMR nuclear to make clean fuels that then transition to be exported to other parts of the world and actually used in Alaska. And that all plays into essentially an energy hub that powers the state and citizens, low-cost energy in the state that's clean and also supporting the goals and aspirations of the countries that are nearby. You can imagine there's a lot to be excited about. So I'm not saying that this is exactly what it's going to look like in 2040, but like I will come back and check. I wouldn't be shocked if that was true. So very excited. Thank you all for the time. I will let the evening close so that we have a chance to go out to dinner soon. But thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. That was great. So we're lucky we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So thank you for being willing to sit here with me and take a few questions. If you are online or in person and you want to scan the QR code on the screen, you can submit questions to us. And I do have an iPad here so that your questions will show up. But Jesse, talk to us a little bit about if you expect the next 10 years of energy transition to be a burden for Alaska or a blessing for Alaska?
No, very good question. As everyone in the room knows, energy prices are not cheap if you live in the state. At the same time, with the potential development that we've heard about over the last day, and what we see with resources that could be exported in ways that the policies both from the federal government and from the state government are coming through, I'd expect that the governor and his team and the way that policies and the EPA and everyone that needs to come together to get things permitted, I would expect to see projects which are an economic benefit to the state, both in terms of job, external investment, but also should help lower energy costs. And so that I think is probably the aspiration of everyone in the room. But that is the place that we are now, where that energy growth and energy exploration is actually something that can come back and benefit both the state and its citizens, as well as support outside of the state.
So what do you see as the area? Can you pick one or maybe two areas that you see emerging the fastest that would be the best opportunity for Alaska?
Yeah, I mean, we talk, or I personally talk a lot about kind of these next generation of energy technologies, but the resources around natural gas and LNG that could potentially be both cost effective for in-state consumption as well as export are probably one of the biggest near-term opportunities. And then what we're hearing on CCS is, especially with the credits from the IRA and the willingness to pay from countries in the Asia Pacific, are potentially very, very attractive and could cause sort of be the jump start to the engine in the Alaska economy.
So you really think Alaska can compete?
Yes, absolutely.
We can be competitive.
Absolutely.
And statewide?
A couple of things. The proximity to Japan and some of the other Asia Pacific countries that have made massively aggressive decarbonization commitments. We do a lot of managing or modeling in places like Japan. It is probably, it's either Japan or Singapore are the hardest places on the planet to decarbonize. And so when you think about people willing to pay for that benefit and the ability to actually provide it, Alaska is well positioned, also largely because of the sort of the geopolitical nature and the relationship nature. And then on top of that, you have fantastic resources on the North Slope that you can tap into. And geothermal is starting to get a lot more attention and research through parts of both the continent or the lower 48. But the resources here mean that you can immediately jump into it. All of those will give you a bit of a benefit to get going.
That's good news. We like hearing that. So here's a question for you. Do you see a risk to electrification as a global solution to mobility as a result of limits on mineral supply, and then in parens, i.e. copper, rare earth elements, et cetera?
Yeah, things like cobalt and nickel are not available everywhere, and they're critical elements. So yes and no. We're not there yet in terms of reaching the limits. There are very smart folks who are engineering out the chemicals or the rare earths that are needed that are the most at risk. But I would say we certainly don't know, or we haven't located the deposits necessary to cover the global transportation need. So there's certainly a risk, but I think it feels like on the list of risks sort of related to climate and energy, it's probably in the top 10, but it's nowhere near the top 5.
Well, that's good news. What sort of market pressures have you seen elsewhere resulting from renewable portfolio standards, and do you think that a similar impact would materialize in Alaska?
So our RPS standards are basically drive utilities and local state agencies to purchase renewables, right? Like, so in California, they're shooting for 60% renewable power by 2030, and it means that the big utilities there have to go buy solar farms and are actually LADWP is investing in a hydrogen project. It's going to be pretty expensive, but a good demonstration. It's certainly driven up the cost historically in some places, but if we look at sort of the slice of things from the last 10 years and then the next 10 years, we've actually brought the cost down. And so it would need to be done in a smart way. I think what qualifies as an RPS technology is different by state. So some people look at biofuels and say no, and others say yes. So depending on how it's written in Alaska, it could be the thing that sort of gets investment spurred because it sort of guarantees a need for the resources. But again, it needs to be done a little bit smartly because California and Florida and Texas have a very different resource profile than Alaska. And if you sort of try to force fit those policies, you may end up in a place that actually doesn't benefit everyone.
That's a good point. So here's a question. Given the uncertainty of impact scenarios that you demonstrated, what is the single most uncertain factor today in developing current impact scenarios? Did we stump you?
Yeah. I think the easy out is sort of the black swan, I don't know button. I don't think none of us saw COVID coming, or at least I don't know anyone who did. Same with you probably could see geopolitical tension rising in Eastern Europe, but no one expected, or at least none of the markets priced that in. So the next major geopolitical event, so Fukushima in some ways broke Japan's power sector. There could be another version of that. I think the boring economic pieces of we know what it takes to get oil and gas resources out of the ground. Even if solar doesn't get cheap quite as fast as we think, it's still relatively cheap today. All of that's pretty bland. I think it's some of these things that could be more geopolitical shocks is where I'd sort of say the cheat answer is.
Okay. And then here's the last question for you. How do popular EGS sentiments driving Wall Street funding at this time need to change in order to support these projects?
No, that's also a good question. So the idea of investment dollars sort of seeing the color of what they're buying, and in some cases locking out of resources. I think being a bit more holistic about what the energy system is evolving toward and a little less black and white on resources probably gets us to a better answer. I mean, I can understand why it's simple to say none of A or none of B and only C. But what that'll do is that'll starve investment in resources that would actually get us onto sort of a more orderly transition.
I said it was the last one, but
Okay.
I was kidding. So do you see any movement to improve the resilience of energy grids?
I see a lot of talk. It's somewhat difficult. Transmission and distribution is the main grid. I think the nice thing is pipelines and pipe infrastructure tends to be relatively reliable. We've seen some issues in the U.S. cold weather, so that is being addressed. But things like needing new transmission infrastructure to sort of diversify and make the system more resilient, these are long, slow processes. It takes forever to build a line. We will likely see more blackouts and events before I think we see something that fixes it.
Okay. So you're going to love this question. Would you recommend a new natural gas pipeline in Alaska as a smart investment?
I feel a little on the spot. It depends on what it costs, I would say. How about that? But I am a big fan of diversified energy infrastructure. I think that recognizing that the word stranded is a bit of a loaded term, and it doesn't necessarily mean what we think it does. There can be things that are very beneficial for a few years, even if they may not get used, and then at the same time provide resiliency if they do. And so it certainly depends on what it costs, who's paying, who's burdened with it, but new infrastructure tends to not be a bad thing when it comes to the energy sector.
Okay. So we have two more. I want to honor the questions that have been sent in. We do appreciate the audience participation. You listed hydrogen as a power generation resource. Isn't it more of an energy source medium?
It's a carrier. That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. That's correct.
And does your analysis fully account for climate effect of methane leakage, which tends to be underreported and underestimated?
I think at least a lot of the work I do is on the energy consumption side, and I think methane reduction and methane, abating methane emissions is probably the easiest and cheapest, or among the easiest and cheapest pathways. And the fact that you've got resources on the North Slope that are quite clean for that, I think is not a bad thing. I'll sort of leave it at that.
Okay, great. Jesse, thank you so much. And you do a great job.